It seems rather unnecessary now, but I'll say that my name is Roger Yates, and thanks for coming. I normally do kind of two types of talks. So I do a bit of sociology. I talk about socialization processes and social movement theory, that kind of idea. And I also do things relevant to the movement issues, and this is one of those. And so I want to thank the organisers really, because they asked me to do this particular talk. And so what I'm going to talk about, it's in two halves, just two 10-minute halves really, is about how big the idea of veganism is, and also point out that there's a threat to the bigness of veganism, in the sense that there's a threat at the moment from within the movement against the philosophy of veganism. And I'm very worried about that, and I oppose it. And my kind of plea at the end would be for everybody else to oppose it as well. So the time for veganism is now, which kind of sounds like a strange phase in some ways, but I always kind of relate to the fact that when I arrived in Ireland, which was about 11 years ago, I was told that Ireland isn't ready for veganism. And I said, well, let's get it ready for veganism then. And we're kind of doing that now. We're in the process of doing it. And not only is it, the time is now, but the time is also ripe. So you might recognize this. This is a line from the very first newsletter that Donald Watson wrote when the Vegan Society wasn't even called the Vegan Society at the time. So we were talking about 1944, and he's saying that we need to ripen people up to new ideas. What he's getting at, essentially, is that people don't just magically find new ideas, although they can by reading everything, but you've got to ripen them up. So you need to talk to them about it. And then they go through that kind of process. You know, once they stop falling off the chair every time you mention it, and they stop laughing, then they might assess it. The example I give is in 1975, Peter Singer wrote Animal Liberation, and he starts the book with something of an apology. He says that the idea of animal liberation might seem like a parody of the human liberation movement, but he was then going to plea that, but this is a serious matter, and I want you to assess it after you hear my case. But now, if you talk to people about animal liberation, they're not going to fall off their chairs. You know, back in those days, they may have done. The same with the notion of animal rights. Animal rights is a bit more philosophical, and so some people think it's harder to talk about. But again, you can talk about the concept of animal rights, and people, you know, are not shocked anymore. You know, and the same goes with veganism. So, you know, the idea that we can't talk about veganism, which is what's been suggested by some people in the movement, or that we shouldn't, you know, on a tactical level talk about veganism, I think is wrong. This is the time for veganism, in my view. And just to clear up a couple of things about that, is that Don Watson actually was a co-founder of the Vegan Society rather than the founder, and it always credited for coining the word vegan, whereas there is some evidence that his wife, Dorothy, or Dot, was the person who did that. And of course, as we know, male voices tend to override female voices in social movements. So there is some idea that that might be the case, that, or they might be done it collaboratively, but it's not certain that he was the founder or the coiner of the word. So if we go into what is vegan, I'm not going to read this out. So if you want the PowerPoint, you're welcome to contact me, roger.yates@ucd.ie, and I'll send it to you. I'll be happy to do that. Essentially, what I've done is just picked out some ideas which show how big the idea of veganism is. It's a big, overarching justice for all philosophy. So I'm just going to pick out one bit. This is Leslie Cross from 1951, so when he was part of the English Vegan Society. And he says here that in this light, veganism is not so much welfare as liberation. So it's not about welfare, it's about liberation. It's also about abolition, as you can see there in the yellow. So at the moment, these kind of quotes are being used to, as it were, put Gary Francione a little bit in his place, because, as you may know, Francione runs a counter movement to our movement. He thinks we're all vile welfarists, and he's the only, you know, real vegan and all this kind of stuff. And so people have been using this to say that some of the ideas that Francione claims to be his, and that everybody else is plagiarizing him, were actually in existence when Francione himself was a teenager, sometimes a child, and sometimes even before he was born. The same would apply really with animal rights in terms of like Tom Reagan. Tom Reagan's work came into fruition in 1983 with the Case for Animal Rights, and he began working on that in the late 70s. But again, we're talking about 20 years earlier than that with this particular quote. This is the 1950s. So we've got a big idea. When we're talking about veganism, we've got a big idea. And it is true that the focus of veganism has always been about our relationships with other animals. That's true back when it was founded as a social movement, and it's true now. What's not true is that the scope of veganism is just about that. It's not just about health, it's not just about environment, but it's also not just about our relationships with other animals. So even people who take a wider view of veganism often stop there. And that also is kind of a mistake in my view. The original pioneers of the vegan social movement, as opposed to the idea of veganism, but the actual social movement, they saw it as part of the peace movement. Now, we've got to recognise these are radical people. We're talking about 1944. The Second World War was still raging, okay? And Donald Watson was a conscientious objector and effectively declared peace through veganism at the time of war. It's quite a radical idea. They've got this image of like gardeners and kind of like English gentlefolk, and they certainly didn't write in the kind of polemic way that we're used to now, and they don't write in kind of 20th century sound bites, but these are radical people, you know. So they saw veganism as part of the peace movement, and they also see it as part of the moral evolution of humanity. You know, so big ideas. Donald Watson claimed that veganism was the greatest cause on earth. And by that, I think he means it was an overarching principle. Yeah? And now, in the 21st century, I'm sure he will be talking about integrating things like feminism, anti-racism, anti-ableism, this kind of thing, into the kind of thrust, if you like, or the scope of veganism. So, a pretty big idea. This, again, really, I'm not going to read it out, but it basically says that, you know, it's an all-encompassing thing. It's a principle from which certain practices logically flow. So another kind of big idea, but basically it boils down to veganism for the original founders were about peace, were about justice, were about fairness. And so we're dealing with a justice for all philosophy when we're dealing with veganism. So that's kind of at the end of part one, but this is like a summary of that. Veganism should be regarded as a very radical idea, a revolutionary idea. And we can judge that by thinking about the originators of the social movement, when they did all that and what they said. And for us now, veganism remains a big threat to cultural speciesism. And that's our number one, as animal advocates and vegans. The number one target is cultural speciesism and the rights violations which are embedded within that. You know, if we can't do anything about cultural speciesism, we're not really going to do very much, ever.
Sorry, Roger, could you explain what that means? Culture and species?
Yeah, it means that the idea of speciesism, that the human exceptionality, that kind of thing, is embedded within the culture, is institutionalized. You know, so in other words, our children are born into a society in which they are told that they are much more morally valuable than children, that kind of thing, and that is repeated. That's institutionalized throughout society. So cultural speciesism is our number one thing, and if we can't shift the paradigm on that, we're only going to tinker at the edges in the same way as kind of animal welfare tends to tinker at the edges. We need vegan animal rights, and if we got anything like that, then we could make real change. Now, as I said then, this is part two really, veganism is currently under attack, and it's under attack from people within the movement. And I'm very worried about this, and my plea to everyone here is to resist this attack. So this is some of the details. Effectively, what you've got is a cartel of people going around from conference to conference to conference, telling audiences of young, impressionable vegans that the best way to promote veganism is by not being vegan themselves, in a dietary sense, and to reject the philosophy of veganism to the extent of mocking the philosophy of veganism. So, first of all, they say to people that vegan, the word vegan is a scare word. You shouldn't use it. It's going to scare people away. You know, if you use the word vegan, you're going to have a problem. It's better to use veg or vegetarian or vegan, these kind of ideas. And built into that is the crazy vegan stereotype. And now, okay, we know, we've probably been on social media and maybe Facebook in particular, and we've seen some pretty fruity things being said on there, and things in a claims-making sense is not too good, right? But they're talking about street vegans. In other words, vegans like myself and some of the people here who are doing 10 hours of vegan education every week, you know, and what they'd be telling these young impressionable vegans is that we're there on the streets, flailing our arms about and screaming abuse at people. That's what they tell them, that's what we do. This is the crazy vegan. The crazy vegan stereotype is code for consistent vegan and ethical vegan. Because what these people want is veganism with flexibility and exceptions. So the reference to this rabbit is we have to think that we have a relative who's got a particular thing about a particular dish which contains animal products. Well, what's wrong with them eating that dish once or twice a year and still being regarded as a vegan? That's what they want. One of them would say that what they want is for all vegans to be able to eat non-vegan stuff and still be regarded as a vegan, okay? And the part of their thing is, if you can see that there, it's a little bit light there. The idea is that if someone gave you enough money, would you eat other animals? It's part of their, they've got a whole bunch of kind of bizarre, kind of philosophical mind games and hypotheticals, you know? So you have to imagine that you're in a restaurant, somebody's eating a steak, and then they get taken ill and leave. And a millionaire then comes up to you and says, if you finish the steak, I'll give you a lot of money. Should you do it? The latest version of this is, you have to imagine there's a burning building. Inside the building is a child and a very valuable Picasso painting. Which one do you rescue? Essentially, this view is coming from what we call philosophically utilitarianism. Okay, it's a balancing act, the greater good. And what they would say is, yes, you should eat the steak, take the money, and then use the money to help other animals other than the one that you're now consuming. And yes, indeed, you should save the painting, sell the painting, and then you can use the money to help more children than the one who's perished in the fire. Now, this is utilitarianism, and from a rights-based position, it's rather obscene, and it should be rejected, in my view. So veganism is a scare word, we're told, and so we should minimize or eliminate, at the moment, ideas like vegan, ideas like animal rights, and ideas like anti-speciesism, unless you're talking to a university audience, that kind of thing. Because what they're suggesting is that we're in a two-phase model, and that we're in phase one. Phase one is pre-vegan. People don't understand veganism. You can't talk to people about veganism. We're in phase one. We've got to wait for them to be ready before we can talk to them about veganism. And so they suggest we should minimize that. Essentially, what they're suggesting is that they are a cartel of professionals, experts, and people like us schmucks in this room, we're just civilians, okay? So these experts should be able to tell us what strategies to use which are best to bring about veganism, which essentially, as I said again, what they say is the best way to advance veganism is not to be vegan yourself, dietary, and to also reject and mock the philosophy of veganism. So that basically means that everything that we do in Dublin is completely wrong. You shouldn't be having these big vegan signs. This is a disaster in their views. If you do this, you're never going to get an audience. People are going to be scared away because veganism is a scare word. Of course, in real life, it turns out to be wrong. You can get people coming up. We get people coming up all the time. We can get crowds at our events. We talk about veganism. We've got big vegan signs. Shouldn't do that, according to these people. Yeah, we do it all the time. People come up. I tend to regard people as kind of vegan curious nowadays. Everybody seems to have some questions about veganism. You know, they want to come up. We get a lot of vegetarians coming up, and they want to sample the plant-based cheeses and stuff. You know, people are not frightened of us. You know, it's not a thing. And this is probably the biggest mistake we could ever make. This is our double gazebo that sometimes appears in Dunleary. As you can see, big vegan signs, Vegan Information Project, Vegan Information Day. Down the legs of the gazebo, vegan slogans. There's even an anarchist t-shirt store in there, which means that if somebody wants a t-shirt, they would make it there and then in front of them and give it to them for a donation. So this will be a complete disaster in relation to what these people are saying. And I repeat, they're saying this to impressionable young vegans from conference after conference after conference and worldwide. Is it having an effect? Unfortunately, yes. This is some of them. There's an idea going around, it's been around for a little while actually, about lacto-vegan. So vegans who can consume dairy products. A recent one is vegan except for bacon. Yeah, so this is one of the ideas that are floating around. And then the venison one is a bit more philosophical, but no less bizarre. What you've got to imagine is you're walking through a wood, as it were, with your knife and fork in hand, and a deer graciously dies before you. It wouldn't be wrong to cut a piece of venison from this deer and still think of yourself as vegan. That's part of this kind of view. Roadkill is sometimes an issue. Backyard eggs from rescued hens is sometimes an issue in the vegan community, as is the fact whether we can ride horses, especially rescued horses, because they need exercise. Can you do it any other way? That's been a bit of a one. And then there's honey, which, if this is not this might be a speciesist term, it's kind of dogged the social movement for years, the question of honey, and from like the 80s and 70s. It was a matter of individual conscience, but now it's been firmed up again, and the declaration is that honey is indeed not a vegan product. So, in this conversation, in this battle of ideas within the movement, if you like, there are three camps. And the size of the camps can be measured by the length of the names. There are always more reducitarians than there are vegetarians. There are always more vegetarians than there are vegans, which incidentally throws into doubt this idea that vegetarianism is a gateway to veganism. Now, it is for some people, and it might be for some people here. But in terms of general things, what vegans tend to say nowadays is not go vegetarian first. They tend to say things like be as vegan as possible to keep the focus on veganism itself, right? So, I want to make it clear that I'm not objecting to the existence of reducitarians or vegetarians, or even the fact that they campaign. That's not a problem for me. What the problem is that they want the vegans to do that campaigning, to do the less than vegan campaigning. Why? I think it's because they recognise that vegans, I'm losing my voice here, are the activists of the movement. You know, some people will quibble at that, but in general terms, we are the activists. They want us to do their work. I say the small group of vegans should stick with veganism. Yeah, I'll do that in a minute. Now I've got something. Yeah, I'm going to die in a second. But I'm almost finished. So my plea then is for vegans to stick with the vegan message. Don't get sidetracked by any strategist that tells you the best thing to do for veganism is not be vegan, and to reject and even mock the philosophy of veganism. I think it's a bad idea. We should reject it. So, shall we have a talk about that?